life. Because, okay, here we go. And I've already given you a big, long intro. I've talked a little bit about resilience. I've talked a lot about the book, just as a heads up. And then it would start here for listeners. Doctors, Dennis, Jonathan, thank you so much both for joining me. I don't know if you usually do interviews together, but I'm excited to have you both joining me. Thank you.
You're welcome. Happy to be here.
Yeah, happy to be here.
The first one was Dennis. The second voice you heard was Jonathan, or you could just be watching the video. But let me just start with you, Dennis, because you're the senior here, and let's get people drawn in. I mean, your story is pretty interesting, and then it gets crazy because you have the ability to really relate, well, you both do, to what resilience is. Sir, talk to us about how you were shot and almost killed and what that did for you in the end.
Okay. So I live in Westchester and outside of New York. And in our town, there is a local deli. For those of you who are a bit older, think of Cheers, where everybody knows each other. It's kind of the center of town. And I would go there every morning on the way to work and pick up a coffee and a bagel, and then go on to come to work down here in New York City at the Mount Sinai Medical School. So actually 7 years to the day. So this is August 30th, and 7 years to the day.
Wow.
When I walked out of the deli, with my coffee in the right hand, that's relevant, and the bagel in the left hand. And all of a sudden I hear a loud boom, and I look at the right side of my chest, and all of a sudden there's blood coming out. And I looked in front of me, and I saw a person who I didn't immediately recognize because I was mainly concerned about what was going to happen to me. So I ran back into the deli. And, ultimately what happened, well, a little bit of a story there. So I'm going back into the deli, and some very brave friends, who work at the deli, ran out and said to the person who shot me, "You're not coming in." So, ordinary person showing great bravery in a moment of real stress. It was amazing. And ultimately, the person who shot me was captured and identified. And it turns out he was a former Mount Sinai scientist who had been fired 7 years before. So now that's 14 years ago from today, because of scientific misconduct. And I didn't really know him, but because I'm the dean, I make the final decision of the termination. And he became obsessed with me and ultimately tracked me down to where I live in my town in Westchester and shot me. And ultimately I was, so I'm sitting in the deli and I'm doing a little bit, on the envelope, essentially, evaluating, what was going to happen to me. And I figured, okay, I didn't pass out, so probably I was going to be okay. And there was a guy next to me who was not a doctor, and he said to me, "You're going to be okay." And I was thinking, wait a second, you're not a doctor. How do you know? But ultimately, I was taken by ambulance, ultimately to Mount Sinai, where I was in the ICU, intensive care unit for about a week. I did lose half my blood, but I was very motivated to recover. And I said, I can talk about that if you want to ask me more about it.
Well, you know what? I want to get Jonathan in. I want to get Jonathan in here, and by way of him asking you a question or commenting on it to take over. Jonathan, could you take the hosting duties from me? You've heard this story. You know this man. You wrote this book with him. Where do you think the best question is as to what that led to for him and for listeners and readers of your book?
Really, I think what's most striking is wanting to hear more about studying resilience for decades and then having a life-threatening situation. What was your go-to? What were your go-to resilience factors that popped out for you immediately?
Right. So Jonathan is right. I had been studying resilience for, several decades before I got shot. And number one, I didn't know if I was resilient myself because I'm Vietnam era, which means I was in my 20s during the Vietnam War, and I never went because I got a deferment because I was in college and med school. So I was wondering, now I'm going to find out if I'm resilient. And I was going to find out if, whether we had discovered about resilience was going to be relevant to me. And I found that out. I found that being an optimistic person, having people who really cared about me, helped me get through it, having role models, which were the people I ended up had studied who were resilient, was very, very helpful. Setting goals. So ultimately, I found that I was resilient. Now, a little bit of a humorous aspect of it is I'm a big Bruce Springsteen fan. Been to about 30 concerts and all that. And there's a song that he wrote called Tougher Than the Rest. And I kept having that thought, that song in my head was when I was in the ICU, Tougher Than the Rest. And it was kind of a motivating thing for me.
I love that story. I love that a psychiatrist thinks he's really tough too. That really.
I am really tough.
Yeah, I can tell. I've watched all your interviews and I've heard your story. I'm not going to spar with you verbally or physically, sir. Jonathan, Dennis just tells his story. It's 7 years to the day. And as soon as he said that, I thought, well, maybe it's a little sensitive to ask him on this day. But you guys we've all heard this acronym PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You guys talk a lot about post-traumatic stress growth. The point is you can have a traumatic event and it doesn't have to paint your life negatively for the rest of your life. It seems like Dr. Charney has turned this into a positive good. Tell us a little bit about PTS growth.
Okay. So a lot of people who go through a trauma recover. In fact, most people end up recovering. And a lot of those people look back on the trauma and say, I wish it didn't happen to me, but I have become a stronger person from it. And I'm better prepared for what will ultimately happen over the course of my life, because nobody gets out of this life unscathed.
Right.
Other things happen. And that's post-traumatic growth.
Jonathan, what would you add to that?
I would add, too, that one of the things that we've learned over the years from our own healthcare workers and veterans and people we've interviewed is that distress and growth go together. They're inseparable. So we actually know from the research, it's those individuals with a moderate amount of PTSD symptoms that have the most post-traumatic growth, that report the biggest changes in the sense of their own abilities, their strengths, their life priorities, their spiritual sense, and their social connections. Deepening in the aftermath of a trauma, because they're working through those symptoms. They have to kind of figure out how to make sense of them, who they are now, what their future is going to be like. And that meaning-making process that's kind of tough, it's painful, actually catalyzes a lot of growth.
I think the thing that's hard, especially for parents to imagine or to understand, is if resilience is a good thing and trauma is inevitable, what is our role and responsibility as parents? Because we think the primary thing is to keep them safe, protect them. My opinion, my informal research, 18 years as a parent, is that my generation of parents stink because they've got their kids bubble wrapped and they never let them go outside, much less experience some kind of adversity. Dennis, you and I are a little bit different generation, and you tortured your daughter once you learned about resilience, I found out. You learned about resilience and you changed as a parent. You've talked about this openly, sir. Does your daughter still talk to you?
Yes, she does. Well, yes, she does. So, what you're referring to is I felt that if you bring your children up in a totally stress-free environment, they're not ready to deal with the inevitable stressors of life. So I decided that, so I have 5 kids. So I got 4 daughters and a son. Now I've been a parent for 43 years, so it's been a long time. But what I didn't torture, I didn't traumatize my kids, but I did challenge them. Now, one of the ways I challenged them is that the 5 kids and my wife and I, we would take them on adventure trips around the country that I would say there were moments that they were semi-dangerous. You know, we were out in the wilderness, weather changed, wildlife would appear and all that. And I did this with my kids when they were preteens, teenagers. And so there was one event where we were on top of a mountain, bad weather came in, there was some wildlife. And one of my daughters at the time, who was 13, said to me she despised me. And it came like right out of the heart, you know. She despised me.
I love it.
And, you know, that daughter used to be, you know, take a while to get used to new things, you know. And so, and I didn't let that happen in terms of leading her in her journey, you know, as she grew up. So she despised me. Okay, well, what happened? Well, now she's a bit north of 40. She's a mother of 2. She goes to Yellowstone in winter. She climbs mountains. So even though she despised me back then, she's done pretty good.
You know, I heard that story the first time when my daughter was younger, and so she was 7, and I thought, well, my version would be I'm just going to send her into the pizza shop alone. She's going to pay for it, get the slice alone, and she's going to have to overcome. That's going to be the adversity, because parents don't even let their kids out of their sight to do everything for them. My daughter hasn't talked to me since, Dennis, and I it backfired on me.
Well, I'll try to help you. Offline, we'll talk.
Jonathan, that was what I was baiting you into free therapy for all of us. Jonathan, you know, what would you add to the parenting thing? Like, I don't know, I'm being somewhat cynical, but, you know, it is true about my generation of parents being terrified of everything from kidnapping to, you know, ticks outside. And so they keep their kid on a screen. And obviously there's plenty of things to be concerned about. But what would you add to that? What can we do as parents to not necessarily, you know, to offer them those challenges, but not necessarily purposely have this kind of terrible adversity? I obviously shouldn't have used the word torture, because you guys know a thing or two about that.
I would say a couple of things. One is certainly there are challenging things in the world. Bad things happen, accidents happen. So yeah, wear your helmet and your protective gear if you're on your bike. But I would be very cautious about convincing your children that the world is a very dangerous place. Because danger is not necessarily lurking around every corner, and it is not productive to go through life hypervigilant for threat. And so some of these experiences of facing small challenges, whether it's going to order your pizza at the pizza shop or going on a quasi-dangerous mountain hike, helps people tolerate the uncertainty and the difficult emotions that come up, and they learn strategies to manage that. And I would also say, and you know, Dennis and I have talked about this before, it's really important for kids to understand that failure is part of life and failure is part of growth. So team sports, especially younger kids, are protected from failure. Everybody gets a trophy for participation. There's not a sense that like, hey, you can actually grow from falling short. And that's okay. That's part of life. You're not always going to win all the time. And I think there is a undercurrent in some generations of, okay, if I get an A-, the teacher's wronged me in some way, and it's their fault, not mine, and I'm not going to change. They need to change. And I think that's really problematic philosophy.
Post-pandemic, post-COVID, it seems like everybody learned the word resilience. And then maybe what it was, and maybe they got some and established it or didn't. I learned resilience for the first time as a really lucky, privileged man when I was 44 and I lost my dream job. Before that, I'd suffered very few tragedies in my life. I got picked on as a kid, but I was popular, as well liked. But, you know, I lost a friend when I was 20, lost, you know, my grandparents and so on. I lived through 9/11, knew some people that died, and I got jumped a few times, beat up. So I was in a couple of violent assaults, but I never had any kind of PTSD. And I didn't have what I learned was resilience. I'm paper thin. When I lost my job and then my marriage started to come undone, I came completely undone. And I wonder what you have to say about men like me. We obviously understand what those marginalized communities living with all kinds of different stressors in underdeveloped countries, in poor neighborhoods, women, people who've been abused. We get that. We know about that. But there's this generation of guys who've been pretty privileged. And all of a sudden, we have no resilience as a result of losing a job, a marriage, or COVID. Is there anything to what I'm saying, Dr. Charney, first? And I want to hear both of your opinions on this.
Well, I don't think it's just targeted toward men, for example. Women have gone through the same thing. But, as you mentioned, losing a job is tough. Losing friends is tough. And, you do get expected reactions. There's sadness. There's concern about the future. So the real question is, well, what do you do about it?
Sure.
Right. And in terms of what you described, other people have gone through what you've gone through.
No, I was the only one, I felt.
Well, maybe you're the only one in the world, but I don't
Everywhere
think so.
everywhere I looked, everybody. I saw a guy mow his lawn. I go, I bet you that guy's got financial security. I bet he was smart.
So you got to, right. And that could be a problem. But the reality is that other people have gone through what you've gone through and come out the other side, to be happy, lead productive lives, and maybe even become stronger emotionally. And so one of the things, we recommend is you find role models out there.
Yeah.
Right. You connect with people who've gone through it and use what they've done as a bit of a roadmap toward your recovery and being happy again. We've seen that over and over again. And in fact, when I got shot, I had role models. Yeah. And it helped an awful lot. It put in perspective what happened to me, that I could recover. So putting things into perspective and having role models to lead you the way forward toward the light, that's the way to go.
Yeah, you write a lot about that in the book too, the role models thing. Would you add anything to that, Dr. DePierro, about like just the question, if you take gender out of it, it's like, if you got a certain amount of privilege, if you've had a good run, if you will, and then you're in maybe your 30s or 40s or even 50s, and all of a sudden tragedy hits, things fall apart, as Pema Chodron, I love that book, writes, and you have no idea how to react because you don't know, you have established zero resilience. Is that a thing?
It is a thing. And I would say a couple more things that could be relevant here, which is that, many of us go through life, we're going to work, put in our time at work, we come home, we put on the TV, we watch Netflix, we cook dinner, we go to sleep, we repeat the next day. And I think in that, we feel like we're doing all the right things and we've got stuff figured out, but we might lose sight of what's really most important, the sources of meaning in our life.
Yeah.
Family, friends, social relationships, religious faith, if we have a faith we subscribe to, a little dose of physical exercise, routines, social connections. And I think the more you can invest in those things, and it doesn't take a tremendous amount of time, it can become your safety net when things fall apart. If you don't have a safety net of social supports, role models, some self-care before things get tough, it's like it's like a soccer net that has a hole in it.
Yeah. I established a safety net about a year ago, and I have a practice I talk a lot about with listeners and friends, a morning routine, and part of it is reading. And for the last week, I've been reading your third edition of your book, and it's made such a huge impact in my life. And I am so excited and nervous to be talking to two of the co-authors. Of course, we lost the third, Dr. Southwick, in 22, I think.
April of 22. And if you don't mind, Pete, I'd like to say a few words about Steve Southwood.
I was about to ask you. Yeah, please do.
Thank you. Because he was my best friend for 40 years. We talked almost every day, one way or the other. He was the kindest person I've ever met in my life, and he was very resilient also. And he developed prostate cancer about 5 years before he died. And as I mentioned, he died in April of 2022. And his fight against the prostate cancer is paradigmatic for being a resilient person and facing the fight of your life and going through that with courage, and bravery and so forth. And we do have an epilogue in the book,
Yeah.
which is devoted to Steve. And yeah, talk about role models. He's forever a role model to me.
Since you talked to him every day and he was your best friend, and he was brilliant resource and source of scholar of resilience, and then having to learn and live with resilience. My question is, what was his worst day like? Like, he had all the resources. So when he was struggling with his, I don't know, mortality, I don't know what he would even call it. What was his worst day like? Because it makes the rest of us maybe feel a little more human.
Yeah. So Steve was a very active person, physically. He was a star athlete in high school and wrestled and played football part of the time in college, and then with me actually became a competitive kayaker. Was out in the water. And so when Steve got sick, one of the things that bothered him the most, that he couldn't do those things. Although even to the end, I have a picture in my office here, of me and Steve in the fall before he died, out on the water. So, but that bothered him the most, that he couldn't do those things.
Yeah, the things that are your resources to deal with get taken from you. A lot of people,
the things he loved, but
yeah.
But there were other things that he compensated.
Sure.
When he was in that fight for. Yeah.
I did so much background on you, Dr. Charney. I did not find competitive kayaker, and now that we're throwing out the rest of my prep, that's all we're talking about. Dr. DePierro, talk about altruism, because I think that's a really interesting part of the chapter of Moral Compass. I was really surprised to find this as part of this book on resilience, that this was part of your research. I'm just guessing that working with Dr. Charney and Dr. Southwick and having your name on this book and doing the work that you do every day gives you a lot of purpose and a feeling of altruism. I know you get paid for it, so maybe it's not the classic definition, but I'm sure it makes you feel very purposeful, and I'm sure you do a lot of work that you are not paid for or underpaid for. Talk to us about purpose and why that matters with altruism and having a moral compass. Any part of that you want to speak to?
Yeah, I would say that this goes back to social support. One of the things that's, I would argue, is a newer discovery is that we talk so much about getting support from other people, your perceived sense of social support when you're going through something difficult. Do you have somebody in your corner to support you emotionally? Do you have somebody to take you to the doctor, pay your bills, help you with rent? What we don't talk as much about, and actually what Steve was working on in his last year, was understanding the psychological benefit of giving support to other people, being altruistic, giving of your time, giving some money if you have it. That actually blows back on you in a very positive way. And it can give people a lot of purpose and meaning. And, just to go back to Steve, he was retired. He didn't have to do anything related to resilience, writing, speaking, contributing in his last years. He was the most prolific person. He got a lot of meaning out of putting papers out there, contributing to the development of programs at Yale to support healthcare workers during the pandemic, contributing to our program at Mount Sinai to support our healthcare workers. He was incredibly active, generous, and giving of his time, because that's what gave him a sense of meaning and a through line when maybe other things were outside of his control. He knew he could control where he devoted his love.
I love that. There's a chapter in your book about religion and spirituality, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't go right to that one. I have always been, I'm a harsh critic of organized religion for all kinds of different reasons, and I've found spirituality. I've got this practice, and I've been studying Stoicism, which you guys write a lot about as it relates certainly to Admiral Stockdale, the former POW and presidential candidate. You guys studied, as I told in the intro, Vietnam veterans who had been tortured. And so he studied Stoicism. So I'm like, I'll study Stoicism and Buddhism. And so I have this practice now. And so I'm ready to criticize religion. And you guys do it for me. And then you answer my criticisms in it. And you write, individuals who see their God as punitive and judgmental may feel that they deserve their troubles and that their fate is controlled by an unsympathetic, all-powerful being, leaving them with little sense of personal control. And it's got a name, negative religious coping. So that was my criticism. And yet, Dr. Charney, there's a lot of good parts about being religious, which most people identify as. Tell me them and debunk my cynicism.
So it's not one way. So I just take a minute to explain it. So on one hand, a lot of people get enormous benefit and comfort from religion. We found that in our research studies. For example, we did a lot of work in an underserved African-American community in Washington, D.C., that faced poverty and abuse and so forth. And they found enormous comfort from going to church and in the belief in God and the people that surrounded them in their faith. So you see that a lot. And in fact, with one story with the POWs that we got to study with, that there were two POWs that were buddies, friends for life, that were in the same cell for years. And one was very religious. He prayed every day in the cell, and he got great comfort from it. It really helped him get through tough times. And his buddy in the cell was an assault of the earth guy, wasn't religious, but he saw that his friend, his buddy, was getting comfort. So he said to himself, I'm going to be religious for a year. I'm not going to curse. I'm going to try to pray every day. And after about a year, he said, it's not working for me. So it depends. Now, one other little brief vignette. A colleague of ours who became aware of our work wanted to go to Pakistan.
Yeah.
Right? Because there had been an earthquake there that had killed about 250,000 people.
Yes.
So he went to Pakistan and wanted to understand how people were coping there. And he found, sort of like what you said, that the people there who were very remote area felt guilty.
Yeah.
They felt that the earthquake was because they had sinned. So faith and spirituality, it's complicated.
It is, but I will be magnanimous. I mean, I'm being somewhat, critical just to set you guys up for the answers when it comes to religion. But here's one thing: say whatever you want about organized religion. People go to church, synagogue, mosque, whatever. Be as critical as you want, and even say, well, it could be replaced by spirituality, by meditation, and all the things that I do and others practice. But what doesn't come with my meditation is any friends. Like, it doesn't come with a community. Say what you want about religion. They create community. You write a lot about how important this is, and there's a lot more research being done about that. My spirituality doesn't come with that. I'm so proud that I created that in a lot of ways with this podcast. And that's a savior for me and traditional communities as well. I got a lot of friends, but it took a lot of work to create that. It doesn't come with meditating alone. Talk to me about why, community matters so much, and why, of course, that comes with religion. You see people taking care of each other when someone's sick, etc.
Yeah, John knows a lot about that. John, why don't you, talk about all the work you're doing with faith-based communities?
Yeah, I can give you an example of this that we talk about in the book. So Mount Sinai and our spiritual care department has over a decade of partnerships with faith-based communities in New York City, in traditionally underserved areas, Harlem, Bronx, Brooklyn, largely historically Black churches. And we've done a lot of partnerships around health education using the wisdom of the crowd, spiritual texts, and that trust to further population health. And when the pandemic hit, we really saw how these populations were differentially impacted in terms of mortality, the mental health burden, potentially limited access to mental health services. And so one of the things that we did is we took our content that we had been using to help healthcare workers, our content around resilience and how to build your resilience that we talk about in the book, And we taught faith leaders and community health workers in these churches to then go on to teach their congregants about this material. So like in a train the trainer model, we trained some identified leaders, and then they in turn offered workshops around mental health and resilience to 1,000 people over the course of a year. And it was beautiful.
You found that, the population, right, John, that came to the church, we're getting great comfort in going to church, right, during the times in the pandemic, right?
That's right. And a lot of these churches went virtual. They did Facebook Live broadcasts, they did telephone broadcasts, they did Zoom, and really moved to that as soon as they could because they knew that the community heals. Yes, there were empty seats in the pews because congregants had unfortunately died, but they needed that community to get together. And so we see in religion, it checks a lot of the boxes around resilience, optimism, community, and physical activity, right? You have to, like, now at least pandemic's over, you gotta like get up, get showered, and go to church or go to mosque or go to temple. It's a physical action.
So is physically cooking something for someone and going to their house, watching their kids, working on a project in the community. I do think that so many of these virtual communities popped up as a result of the pandemic. And I think so many people, I'm certainly still carrying on mine. We get 50, 60 people every Thursday, and it's amazing. It is like a rejuvenation every week. And I'm sure it's similar to what folks that, are more religious go to. Guys, here's the thing. At the beginning, you're scientists. You do research. There's research in the book. The thing that bothers me a lot is this crop of pseudoscientists who have podcasts and YouTube channels, or your friend who you really like, who's constantly talking about the prefrontal cortex. These people have to. My buddy is telling me about the amygdala, and I'm like, dude, you are a musical theater performer. I don't like when non-doctors talk about the prefrontal cortex. Everybody's telling me about cortisone. Pete, that's your cortisone levels. No, it's not. I smoked pot and drank a pot of coffee. It's probably one of those two things. Gentlemen, tell me the science around these things and how annoyed you are when you hear those people talking about that and getting it wrong. How do we talk about this, the actual science, why it should matter to those of us who are trying to understand resilience? Dennis?
Okay, so we actually don't mind when non-scientists talk about science.
Okay.
One of the ideas of the book that we hope it separates from other quote self-help books is that we do talk about the science. We do talk about evidence, so that when we make recommendations, it's not just off the top of our head, but it's based on observation and hard science that we feel confident is true. So when we talk about the brain, we felt it was important to talk about the brain because trauma, disappointment, and things like that, they do affect the way your brain is functioning. And what we put in the book is facts about what is now known about how the brain responds to stress. That's number one. And it does involve, by the way, the prefrontal cortex and the amygdala. So whoever said that, they may be right. On the other hand, knowing about how the brain works has resulted in new ideas about treatment. And ultimately, that's the most important thing about the science, that it leads to changing the lives of our patients. And that's starting to happen, whether it's new medicine or new tasks that we've developed that help literally exercise the brain to recover from trauma and depression.
Did I miss the part where you guys talked about pharmaceuticals and medicine, much less, MDMA, which I hear about all day, every day now?
No, we didn't put in the book, the work about psychedelics. In a word, I would say there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah.
Potential for good, and in some cases, potential, for some degree of harm. But the work's going to come out. There are going to be large-scale studies that are going to be reported.
Yeah.
It's going to be submitted to the FDA, for approval of these psychedelics for treatment. So it's a process right now, and we'll know, I think, in the next year, we'll get some good guidance on how to use psychedelics. But
Resilience is
we didn't want to put it in the book. It was too
that's
early.
fine. Yeah, no, I figured there's so many different resources and ideas and research in this. I guess it's a little book. I would keep reading past the last page though, and you have updated it now a couple times, certainly since the epidemic. One of the chapters, I believe it's the name of the chapter. Yeah, face your fears. Resilience oft is needed as to develop as of being some kind of terrible setback, trauma, obstacle in life. We talk a lot about resilience in many ways, but obviously childhood trauma is something that everybody's seemingly digging into. And people either say they suffered it or they didn't. I think a lot of people don't even know. If you listen to some people like this guy, I don't know if you guys like him or not. I don't know. The verdict's still out. This guy, Gabor Mate, he's like, if you were spanked, you suffered trauma and your parents. I'm like, all right, I'm not having to revisit that. My mom hit me with a ruler once. I'm okay. But so many people have had such serious childhood trauma, sometimes static every day, sometimes every week. The point is, what you're saying is I feel like what you're saying here is you have to face your fears, Jonathan, or else you can't figure out how to develop the resilience needed to deal with those traumas, whether it's, you're a veteran of combat or a child and you suffered that trauma.
Yeah, so I think one of the main thrusts of that chapter is that, yes, things happen to us. We fall off a horse, and the most important thing we can do is get back on. Some things might have happened to us in childhood that affected our ability to trust people, and we have a choice. We can decide, okay, I'm permanently scarred from this. Relationships aren't for me. I'm no good at relationships. I'm just going to be alone in my apartment for 20 years. Or we can say, okay, this happened to me and there's something I can do about it. So when we're talking about the brain, one of the most important takeaways, and I think this is lost in a lot of writing about the brain and trauma, is that the brain can change. Our psychology can change. Our behavior can change. And we might not have had control over what happened to us at some point in our lives, but we have some control at least on what we do with that experience now. And just going back to Steve's story for a moment, many years ago in the 90s, he ran a group at a VA hospital with veterans who had been through combat. And he said, hey, you're all experts in PTSD. You live it every day. It's your choice what you're going to do with that.
I've studied that issue and talked to veterans for a long time, not studied like you guys studied. I hate when people that aren't actually studying just read something, but I know a lot of veterans. I understand how they struggle and what is happening. The suicide epidemic with this generation, much less the last generation, is crazy. But those guys, like the toughest thing you can do is facing your fears and talking about them. How much do we need more to just talk about these things? When we talk about facing your fears, there's more to it, Dr. Charney. What does it actually mean in practice if the fear you have is something that happened long ago, perhaps?
Well, first you mentioned childhood trauma. It is the worst trauma, though. When you've been, say, sexually abused by a family member, that is the worst. And that does require, a lot of work, to recover from that. You can, but it does require a lot of work, and you don't want to keep it inside. You want to seek help to recover from that, understand it, and move forward. Facing your fears is really important because if you don't face your fears, you can become housebound. You restrict your life. It's not good, but you can face your fears. And when you have a fear, the approach is to face it one step at a time. If you're, we met with Navy SEALs, for example, and they, at some point, when they got a rescue to do, they would jump out of an airplane in the middle of the night into enemy territory. Right? They've done that to get people, Americans, out of harm. But so we would say to them, well, how did you do that? Were you afraid? One thing they said, you take it one step at a time. The first thing you do is not jump out of an airplane in the middle of the night. You do it one step at a time. And, we would say to them, are you fearful? Are you a fearless person, or do you experience fear? And they would say, of course I experience fear.
Yeah.
Being not facing your fear, not understanding your fear gets you in trouble. So the message is, to your question is, yes, face your fears, but work at it one step at a time.
I like it. Last one I want to ask you, my time is almost up with you, and I barely got to half the book, is to mind your body for resilience. Like, I understand, I think, how that works with stress, which I suppose can feed into resilience, but why did you see the need, or what does the research say about how physically you can develop resilience? Is that the question I want to ask, Jonathan? Dr. DePierro?
Yeah, so this chapter, and Dr. Charney is a very good example of this, and I'm getting there, is really primarily about physical exercise. There's a lot that can be learned through team sports, like communicating, working together, building relationships, challenging yourself, facing failure, but also a lot to be learned from engaging in just some kind of regular physical activity. It doesn't need to be on the exercise bike 5 days a week for 3 hours. Just move your body, because we know that basically any physical exercise conveys a mental health protective effect. People who have some depressive symptoms, physical exercise helps speed up their recovery. People who exercise are actually protected in some studies longitudinally from developing things like depression and anxiety, especially if it's part of their habits, if they make it a routine. And many studies show that it prolongs people's lives. People who have a physical exercise practice tend to live longer, tend to be less likely to have a cardiovascular event, which is the number one killer in people. So that we can't write a book about resilience without emphasizing that. And we know that people can really push themselves beyond self-perceived barriers by engaging in an increasingly challenging physical workout routine, and they can build self-confidence. And that self-efficacy and self-confidence is the fuel that you need when stuff goes wrong.
Dr. Charney, exercise is hard. It's intimidating. I don't want to do it. It can be brutal. You're a competitive kayaker, and apparently you're practicing what you preach in other ways as well. Are we also talking about diet too here, or what do we mean when we talk about how your body can be used to develop resilience?
Yeah, it's a number of different things. Exercise, we feel, is very important. It does change the brain. So the chemicals that change through exercise does change the brain too. It's been shown improves your cognition, it improves your emotions. So a lot of good things happen with exercise, not just your heart and all that. That's good too. And diet's important. What you put in your body also affects your well-being and your brain and your body. So taking a holistic point of view for caring for your well-being, sleep, moderate use of alcohol, exercise, all that makes you feel better as a person and better prepared for stress.
What about fruit pie? I didn't hear anything about. I love pie.
Well, in moderation, along with the exercise.
By the way, everything in moderation.
I do love fruit pie myself, and I take it.
Well, listen, I say that because we have a sponsor. Basically, it's a mom and pop right here. There's one in Westchester now. You might have heard it. Noble Pies. They'll bring you a pie, Dennis. They'll bring you one if you want. Once you come on the show, you want a pie, you get a pie.
Okay, there's my hand. It's raised.
Well, you do have to say thank you to Noble Pies ahead of time. Dennis, he refuses to sell out. It's back to that moral compass subject. Gentlemen, it's just an honor to talk to you. I mean, it's the coolest thing about my work is getting to read a book and then talk to the author. So I hope I did it some justice, but I highly recommend that everybody listening go buy this book. It's the 3rd edition. It's updated with what we all know from the COVID epidemic and the resilience that hopefully we got from it. I really appreciate your time. Congratulations, and thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
All right, don't go anywhere because I got to upload.